Hey everyone! Welcome to our first video in the series Cosmere 101. As I mentioned in my plans for this channel video, I'm a huge Brandon Sanderson Cosmere novel fan, and since we had a Cosmere novel released at the beginning of July, The Isles of the Emberdark, and we've got the Stormlight RPG Player's Handbook for the Cosmere RPG game set being released to backers in PDF form on July 23rd, I thought I'd get started on this concept, this series. And what better way to start than with the basics? I am going to try to keep this relatively spoiler-free, but if there's interest, or if I just feel like doing it a little later, I will make some spoiler-full videos a little later on down the line. So what is the Cosmere? Well, this is the fictional universe Brandon Sanderson created for his novels, not all of them, but a large number of them, and a key element of this fictional universe is that it is shaped and influenced by the power of a mysterious force called Adonalsium, and its shards. The Cosmere novels include the Mistborn series, of which we have a full trilogy and a full quartet that have been finished, and Brandon is at this very moment working on the third era, which will be a trilogy. And there has been promise of a fourth series later on. The Stormlight Archive series, which is a promised series of 10 books, the first 5 have already been released at the time of this recording, and the back 5, as Brandon often refers to the last 5 books, are in the planning stage. Once he finishes the Stormlight series he's working on now, he's going to do 1 or 2 other things and then get into Stormlight again. Elantris, which was his first published Cosmere novel, but once he finishes the Mistborn trilogy he's working on now, he has promised to write 2 sequels to Elantris, making that into a trilogy too. Warbreaker is another standalone Cosmere novel, oftentimes described as something of a prequel to the Stormlight Archives, and there has been some talk of maybe a sequel to Warbreaker called Nightblood. White Sand was one of the first things that Brandon Sanderson wrote. It didn't get published at the time, but he worked in partnership with Dynamite Comics to turn the White Sand novel he had written into a 3-part graphic novel. And there's been talk of making a sequel to that graphic novel and turning the graphic novel into a prose version so that there'll be a prose book version of the story for all the Cosmere enthusiasts out there like me. The Arcanum Unbounded is an anthology which has stories from all across the published Cosmere novel worlds, and even 1 or 2 new ones. Now, the secret projects that I mentioned earlier, there are 5 of them, but 4 of the secret projects were Cosmere novels, set in never-before or rarely seen worlds in the Cosmere. And then, way down the line on the radar here, Brandon's been talking about writing a novel set on the world of Threnody for some time. The tentative working title of that concept is called The Night Brigade. The Aether of Night series is something that Brandon had written a Aether of Night novel back in the day. It never got published, but he was thinking of reworking the story, keeping the Aether magic system in it, but reworking the actual plotline and characters into something else, and possibly making a trilogy out of that. And then lastly, the penultimate Cosmere series that he's talked about writing is called Dragonsteel, which his publishing company is also named after. Now, he's been talking about making this Dragonsteel series, which will be effectively a prequel to everything else in the Cosmere, and this is going to be a series about the shattering of Adonalsium, the creation of the shards, and introducing a character called Hoid, which, if you've been reading the Cosmere novels, he's in just about every one of them in some way, shape, or form. But all 3 of these, the Night Brigade, the Aether of Night series, the Dragonsteel series, they're pretty far down the pipeline. He has said that he has to finish the Stormlight Archives first and finish Mistborn Era 3 first, as well as the Elantris sequels. And I believe he mentioned that the 4th Mistborn series that he's been talking about will take place after everything else that's been written in the Cosmere, and it will be released after Dragonsteel. That way you'll have the very beginning of the story of the Cosmere before he releases the very end of the story in the Cosmere. Now, this is a beautiful star map from the book Arcanum Unbounded, and this shows you the relative location of several of the prominent worlds in the Cosmere. Not to mention, it just is a beautiful piece of art. All of the art that Brandon has in his books is absolutely amazing. Now, the Cosmere is made up of 3 levels of reality. You have the physical realm, and that would be the planets of the Cosmere, the physical world that people live in, the mundane, if you will. It's physical reality. Secondly, you have the cognitive realm, the realm of ideas and thoughts. In the world of Roshar, more on that later, this is referred to as Shadesmar, and in the cognitive realm, the ideas and concepts people have in their minds are given literal life by the cognitive realm itself. And these memories or souls of objects walk around, some of them gain sentience and talk. And, well, if you're a highly invested person, what that means we'll talk about later, but if you're someone that has a lot of this energy called investiture, you might end up leaving a cognitive shadow behind of that investiture shaped with your personality and such. And this is where things like ghosts or shades or the mighty god Spren of Roshar that power the bondsmiths come into play. And I just said a lot of words there. I'll explain those later on in other videos. And the spiritual realm is the most mysterious. Throughout the various novels of the Cosmere, you'll see, of course, the physical realm where most of the adventures take place. And in Stormlight and in Isles of the Emberdark, we see quite a lot of action on the cognitive realm, but the spiritual realm has only ever been visited once in published Cosmere novels, and that's in the 5th Stormlight book, Wind and Truth. The spiritual realm is a very mysterious place. It is simultaneously the past, the present, and the future, but yet none of them. It is where investiture, the energy of magic in the Cosmere, resides and comes from and ultimately returns to after its use in a magic system of any kind. And some theorize that the spiritual realm is, well, a gateway to the beyond or afterlife. And at any rate, this is the original home of the power of Adonalsium, the powers of creation and investiture that are the source of all magic and shards in the Cosmere. Now, the various planets of the Cosmere are in their own solar systems. The Cosmere is a universe, quite literally. And the major planets of the big standalone and series novels of the Cosmere are represented largely on the left-hand column. Sel in the Selish system is the world of Elantris. Scadrial in the Scadrian system is the world of Mistborn. And the Rosharan system is where the Stormlight Archives takes place, primarily on the world of Roshar, but the worlds of Braze and Ashen have their roles to play in that story. Nalthis, where Warbreaker takes place, is in the Nalthian system. And as we turn to the right-hand column, Taldane, which is the world of the White Sand graphic novels and has a big role to play in the Cosmere as a whole, is the primary planet of its solar system. Threnody, which features largely in one of the novellas found in Arcanum Unbounded, is the primary planet of the Threnodite system, though not the only planet there that has human habitation or a name. And the focus of the most recent novel, The Isles of the Emberdark, is the planet First of the Sun in the Dromonad system. Now, this was also the focus of the short story Sixth of the Dusk, which is largely used as flashback chapters in the opening part of the new novel. Fantastic novel, by the way, recommended highly. And throughout these other novels, a massive number of worlds have either been seen or mentioned, but we haven't seen them on a star map. We haven't seen their physical location in relation to each other. And they include Oberdai, Vax, that's a big mysterious one there, Yolen, Lumar, now that one does show up in a novel, Komashi and Utol also both show up in a novel, the Grand Apparatus, Canticle, that's another novel appearance there, Datri, Mythos, Bajendal, and in future videos we'll be trying to dig a bit more deeply into each of these planets. Central to the Cosmere is the concept of Adonalsium. Adonalsium is the divine powers of creation. It's God's own power. Now, in World, there are scholars called arcanists that debate whether or not Adonalsium was an entity, a being, or an impersonal force. Although the character of Chris tends to suspect that there was a person, or personality at least, behind the power. Now, in the distant mythic past, which will be explored in the future Dragonsteel series, 16 mortals, and I do use the term mortal a little loosely, use special weapons called the Dawn Shards to shatter Adonalsium into 16 shards. Now, there were more than 16 people involved in the shattering, but 16 of them become vessels, becoming shard holders and effectively demigods or gods in the Cosmere. Now, while the bulk of the magic or investiture of the Cosmere is held by these shards and manifests from their magic systems or their interactions with the physical world, there are several types of manifestations of a shard's power below the rank of a full vessel. A sliver is someone who used to be a shard holder, used to be a vessel, but then gave it up or lost it. Holding that much power can change the soul and personality of the former wielder in various ways. A splinter, that's a piece of a shard's power that doesn't have a host, but gains a level of free will and self-awareness, and is completely separate from the parent shard. Now, an avatar, this gets a little nebulous. Avatars are often semi-autonomous or completely autonomous invested beings that are given a massive portion of a shard's power. Now, this is largely seen in the workings of one of the shards named Autonomy, and her avatars range from masks that she wears herself to individual beings that she grants a massive amount of power so long as they serve her intent, and occasionally, at least in one case, avatars that she creates from whole cloth or turns islands into avatars, but that's more on that later. Now, all the shards, the full shards that is, have enough power to shape worlds, to create life or give power, and to see probable futures. That's actually a pretty interesting trait of the Cosmere as a whole. Nobody can really see the future. They can see the possibilities out there. Now, every shard has an intent that you can see in the shard's name. Now, the vessel is able to shape that intent a little bit, but over time, the intent comes to shape the vessel, and it becomes nearly impossible for the vessel to act against the intent of the shard without either losing the shard or opening themselves up to be destroyed by other shards. The 16 shards have all been named as of the 5th Stormlight novel, and they are ambition, autonomy, cultivation, devotion, dominion, endowment, honor, invention, mercy, odium, preservation, reason, ruin, valor, virtuosity, and whimsy. And that's just in alphabetical order, not an order of favoritism or anything. Now, of these 16 shards, the two, preservation and ruin, unite to become harmony in the aftermath of the first Mistborn trilogy. That's a little spoilery, but I'm not telling you who the new holder is. I'm not telling you what the name of that individual is, but quite literally, ever since that third Mistborn book, it's been mentioned in a massive number of other Stormlight books that harmony is the composite, the union of preservation and ruin. So I feel it's kind of a mild spoiler, or not really even a spoiler much anymore unless you haven't read the first Mistborn series. And if there are any other composite shards, we'll save those for the more spoilery territory videos. Now, Odium, the shard of wrath, hatred, passion, that shard and its vessel have been killing other shard holders and often splintering their shards so that no one else can become a new vessel. Now, the known victims of Odium, ambition, devotion, dominion, all three of these shards, their holders were killed, and the shards themselves shattered and either scattered across the Cosmere or locked into place so they could never find another host. Now, Honor, I've got an asterisk by Honor because Honor's original vessel was killed by Odium. Again, that's not a huge spoiler. That's something you find out in the very first book of the Stormlight Archives. But something that is hinted at throughout the Stormlight Archives series is that the holder of Honor is dead, but the shard has not been shattered. Food for thought. I will say nothing more on that topic until it's a spoiler video, but here we go. Now, this is a little breakdown of the 16 shards, their original holders, and what information I've been able to glean from them. We have the names of every shard. We don't have the name of every original vessel of the shard. Ambition, for example, was a female Shodel. I will talk more about them in later videos. And based on the splinters of her investiture that are still floating around in Threnody, most notably the evil, the shades that are heavily influenced by her investiture, and certain snake-like Eliodon creatures in Isles of the Emberdark. They tend to glow with a certain greenish hue, so I consider green to be the color of ambition. We'll do a bit more of a deep dive into the shards a little later on, but as you can see from this chart, every shard has a color that they tend to shine with or that their investiture energy shines with. They generally are resident on a shard world or invested in a shard world, and they tend to have an invested art or magic system that is associated with them, something that initiation is tied to the intent of the shard, and the shard holder has some influence over how it works or how that initiation happens. Now, we are going to go into a bit more depth on each shard a little bit later, but just a brief rundown over here. As you can see, most of the original 16 shard vessels were human. There were 2 dragons that we know of. There was 1 Shodel that we know of. Mercy and Whimsy, we have no idea of the names of those holders, or their species, or their whether they were male or female. Virtuosity is often referred to as a she. Hoyd references that she splintered herself, but we have no idea if Virtuosity's holder was a human or a dragon or a Shodel, whatnot. By the way, humans, dragons, and Shodel, they're the original 3 sentient races from, or species from, the prime world of the Cosmere, that is Yolen. More on that a little bit later. And I've got not a full list of all the investiture arts that are associated with the shards here, but the ones I could fit onto the slide, and a little bit of speculation. We'll talk about the Aethers a bit more, but we really don't have any solid information on shards 11 through 15 in terms of what their magic systems, if they have one, looks like, what worlds they're specifically in. There is some wording in Isles of the Emberdark that makes me think invention, at least for a while, was invested in the Grand Apparatus. A shard named Invention on a planet called a device or apparatus seems very appropriate, and a character from that planet refers to his people as Invention's children, so that seems to match. But again, we'll go into more deep dives over all of these folks here, and you'll notice these are the original shard holders, the ones that are dead from the start of the novels. I went ahead and say it because I wouldn't say it in the chart that they're dead. That's Ulida, Ambition, Aona and Sky for Devotion and Dominion, and Tanavast for Honor. If any of the other shard holders are still the original shard holders, we'll deal with that in a separate spoiler video about the shards. And here we go. Now, investiture. I've said that word a lot. Investiture is the power of Adonalsium in creation. This could be in places, in ecosystems, in individual beings. This is magic. It seems to flow from the spiritual realm, and while it does interact with the cognitive and physical realms, it tends to go back to the spiritual realm after it's been used, like a giant water cycle. The shards are the single biggest focus and quantity of investiture in the Cosmere, and each world has its own unique expression of investiture or magic. There are some common themes between the magic systems, but there is a relatively unique concept of how to gain access to it in each shard's world. Now, each investiture has an initiation. As I mentioned before, that initiation is usually tied to the shard that has some influence over that planet and that magic system. And each investiture system has a focus of some kind that helps filter the raw investiture power into a specific effect or effects. Now, several of the arcanists in the series, most notably Chrysalia, or Chris, from the planet of Taldane, categorizes investiture as either end positive, where power is drawn into the world by the user of the invested art, adding something to the world, at least temporarily, and neutral investiture, where there's no real net gain of new power into the world. It's using what's already there and temporarily using it, recycling it, drawing from your own personal stores rather than drawing it from outside of you, things like that. The most rare of these investiture types is an end negative. And this is when power actually seems to be removed from the world or lost in the process of making the system work. This is considered the rarest form of investiture. Most tend to be end positive. Now, when you get a lot of investiture focused in a single area, when you have massive amounts crashing together or pooling together, this is going to create a number of possible effects. Naturally occurring overlaps tend to create punctures between the cognitive and the physical realm. These are called perpendicularities, and in the physical world, they tend to take the form of shard pools, literal pools of liquid investiture that you can, if you know what you're doing and intend to do so, use to cross over from the physical to the cognitive realm. And this is largely how people in the Cosmere stories go between planets. Because in the cognitive realm, because there's no living minds out in the outer space between planets, there's no one in the physical space of outer space to think about how massively big it is. And so the distances get condensed in the cognitive realm. Now, this is a major plot point in Isles of the Emberdark, and if you haven't read that novel, if you're a backer, I recommend you read it. If you were not a backer and you are hopefully going to be reserving it at your public library or doing pre-orders on Dragonsteel, I think it's a really fun book and gives a lot of cool new lore into the Cosmere. Now, another element of massively concentrated investiture is that it can do some weird things with time. Very strange things with time. But we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Now, these are a bit of a overarching look at the major known types of invested arts. Again, we'll go into more depth of these in later videos, but I have listed by classification and by shard and what you call a user of these arts, what I know of about the initiation, and every system's got a different initiation type. We've got different focus types. Anything you see with a metal focus is probably going to be connected to Scadrial, but we'll talk about that again at a later date. The two bottom ones are pre-shattering investiture arts that have been referenced several times in the Ars Arcanum, or afterwards written in world by the character of Chris, explaining the magic systems to the readers. And I'm very interested when we get to Dragonsteel to see how those pre-shattering arts worked, personally. And that's an end for our first Cosmere 101 video. Next up, we'll do a deeper dive into the planets of the Cosmere, talk a bit about the societies and invested arts on those planets. And once we finish that, we'll be moving on to some magic system territory. But until then, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.